In July 2000, a group of 14 scientists entered Oregon's Blue Mountains on a privately funded expedition, and what they recorded over 13 nights would shake the foundations of wildlife biology. Their thermal imaging cameras captured a massive bipedal figure moving through the tree line at 2:47 a.m., estimated at over 7.5 feet tall, with a stride length no human could replicate. The lead researcher, Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University, later described the thermal signature as consistent with a large, unclassified primate. When the team submitted their findings to the U.S. Forest Service, they were told the footage was inconclusive, and the specific coordinates of the encounter were quietly added to a restricted access list. No explanation was ever given for the restriction. 14 scientists saw something that night, and someone didn't want the public to know where. Oregon has been the epicenter of Bigfoot encounters since long before the creature had a name. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Chinook, Tillamook, and Umpqua, spoke for centuries of a creature they called Tsemekwes, a giant wild man of the woods that walked upright and avoided human contact. When European settlers arrived in the 1800s, the reports didn't stop. They multiplied. In 1904, settlers near the town of Lebanon, Oregon, reported finding enormous human-like footprints along the banks of the South Santiam River, each measuring over 17 inches long. The local newspaper ran the story under the headline, "Wild Man Tracks Found," and hunters organized search parties that returned empty-handed, but visibly shaken. Something ancient lived in these forests, and the people who lived closest to the land had always known it. The modern era of Bigfoot investigation exploded on October 20th, 1967, when Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin captured the most famous piece of cryptid footage ever recorded at Bluff Creek in Northern California, just miles from the Oregon border. The film shows a large, muscular, bipedal creature striding across a dry creek bed and turning to look directly at the camera. For decades, skeptics called it a man in a suit. But in 1999, Dr. Jeff Meldrum and biomechanics experts analyzed the creature's gait and concluded that the compliant walking pattern, the deep knee flexion, would be physically impossible for a human to replicate in a costume. Hollywood special effects artists, including the late John Chambers, who designed the apes in Planet of the Apes, denied any involvement. More than 50 years later, no one has ever produced the suit. No one has ever come forward as the performer. The Patterson-Gimlin film remains unexplained. In the decades following the Patterson-Gimlin film, Oregon became ground zero for an explosion of sightings. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, known as the BFRO, has cataloged over 1,500 reported encounters in Oregon alone, making it the state with the second highest concentration of sightings in America. The hotspots are remarkably consistent: the Cascade Range, the Siskiyou National Forest, the Coast Range, and the remote stretches of the Umpqua National Forest. BFRO founder Matt Moneymaker has personally investigated dozens of Oregon cases and noted a disturbing pattern. The most credible witnesses, the ones with the most to lose by coming forward, are often the most reluctant to talk. They include sheriff's deputies, forestry workers, and active-duty military personnel on training exercises. These aren't people seeking attention. They're people who saw something that terrified them into silence. One of the most compelling Oregon encounters occurred on September 22, 2000, near the town of Estacada in Clackamas County. A U.S. Forest Service patrol officer, whose identity remains protected to this day, reported a face-to-face encounter with a creature standing approximately 8 feet tall in a remote section of the Mount Hood National Forest. The officer described dark reddish-brown hair covering the entire body, a flat face with deep-set eyes, and an overwhelming musky odor. He radioed dispatch immediately, and the recording of that call has never been publicly released. His supervisor filed the report internally, but instructed him not to discuss it outside the agency. When BFRO investigators filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the dispatch recording and the internal report in 2003, they were told both documents were not located. A federal employee saw something in that forest, and the U.S. government made sure nobody else would see the proof. The physical evidence trail in Oregon is what separates these encounters from mere folklore. In 1982, veteran tracker and U.S. Border Patrol officer Paul Freeman discovered a series of enormous footprints in the Blue Mountains of southeastern Oregon near the town of Walla Walla. What made Freeman's casts extraordinary was what forensic analyst Jimmy Chilcutt of the Conroe, Texas Police Department found when he examined them under magnification in 1999. Chilcutt, an expert in fingerprint and dermal ridge analysis for the FBI, discovered that the casts contained dermal ridges, skin patterns similar to fingerprints, running perpendicular to the length of the foot. In humans and all known primates, dermal ridges run laterally. Chilcutt stated publicly that these ridges were not consistent with any known primate, including humans, and could not have been faked with any known technique. The scientific community largely ignored him. The evidence, however, did not go away. Then there are the sounds. On November 17, 2012, a team of researchers from the Olympic Project, led by veteran investigator Derek Randalls, captured a series of bone-chilling vocalizations in the forests east of Cottage Grove, Oregon. The recordings, made with high-sensitivity parabolic microphones, featured deep, resonant howls and a rhythmic wood-knocking pattern that lasted over 40 minutes. When audio engineer and bioacoustic specialist Dr. Robert Benson analyzed the recordings, he determined that the vocalizations were produced by a chest cavity significantly larger than any known North American mammal, including bears and elk. The frequency range fell between 20 Hz and 900 Hz, a range achievable only by an animal with a massive thoracic structure. The recordings were submitted to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Their official response was 2 sentences long. "We cannot identify the source of the recordings. No further investigation is planned." End of story. Or so they hoped. Here's where the conspiracy deepens. Multiple former U.S. Forest Service employees have come forward anonymously to claim that the agency maintains an internal, unpublicized policy regarding Bigfoot encounters. A retired district ranger from the Willamette National Forest, speaking to investigative journalist David Paulides in 2012, alleged that any reports of large bipedal creatures or unexplained oversized footprints are to be filed under wildlife misidentification and forwarded to the regional office, not to local wildlife agencies. Paulides, a former police detective and author of the Missing 411 book series, has documented cases where the Forest Service closed large tracts of land to the public without providing a reason that matched any known wildlife management protocol. In August 2014, a 30,000-acre section of the Umpqua National Forest was closed for what was officially described as resource management activities. No logging was conducted. No controlled burns were performed. The closure lasted 11 days, and no further explanation was ever offered. The connection between Bigfoot sightings and unexplained disappearances in Oregon's national forests adds an even darker dimension to this mystery. David Paulides has cataloged over 60 cases of people who vanished without a trace in Oregon's wilderness under circumstances that defy conventional explanation. Many disappearances occur in clusters. the same areas, the same time of year, and overlap almost perfectly with Bigfoot sighting hotspots. In 2011, a 19-year-old hiker vanished from a well-marked trail in the Mount Hood National Forest. Search and rescue teams with dogs covered every square mile within a 10-mile radius. They found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no remains. 3 weeks prior to the disappearance, 2 separate hikers reported seeing a large, dark bipedal figure crossing the same trail at dusk. When Paulides requested the case files under FOIA, the National Park Service charged him over $1,400 for the documents, many of which arrived with entire pages redacted.
In 2013, Dr. Melba Ketchum, a Texas-based veterinary forensic scientist, published what she claimed was the first DNA study proving the existence of an unknown hominin species in North America. The Ketchum DNA study analyzed over 100 samples collected from across the Pacific Northwest, including hair, tissue, and blood found on tree bark in Oregon's Cascade Range. According to Ketchum, the mitochondrial DNA was conclusively modern human, but the nuclear DNA contained sequences that matched no known species in any database worldwide. The study was submitted to multiple mainstream scientific journals, all of which refused to publish it. Ketchum ultimately self-published in the De Novo Journal of Science, which immediately drew accusations of credibility issues. But the samples themselves were never debunked. No competing lab offered an alternative explanation for the unknown nuclear DNA sequences. The mainstream science community didn't disprove Ketchum's findings. They simply refused to look at them. Now consider what may be the most explosive piece of evidence to ever emerge from Oregon's forests. In September 2017, a retired wildlife biologist named John Mianchinski, a man with over 40 years of field experience with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, went public with an account of an encounter he'd had decades earlier in the Siskiyou Mountains of southern Oregon. Mianchinski described a nighttime visit to his remote camp by a creature that touched his face through his tent fabric. He felt the dermal ridges on its hands, he smelled its overwhelming stench, and he heard it vocalize in patterns that he later compared to rudimentary speech-like cadences. But what Mianchinski revealed in 2017 went further. He claimed that multiple state and federal wildlife biologists across the Pacific Northwest had privately acknowledged to him that the species exists, but that official recognition would trigger the Endangered Species Act, potentially locking down millions of acres of timberland worth billions of dollars. The economic consequences of confirming Bigfoot, he said, are the reason the truth has never been told. So what is truly lurking in the ancient forests of Oregon? Over a century of sightings, thermal footage captured by credentialed scientists, dermal ridges that the FBI's own fingerprint experts couldn't explain, DNA sequences that match no known species on Earth, audio recordings of vocalizations that no identified animal can produce, and a pattern of government silence, land closures, and destroyed reports that suggests not ignorance, but active concealment. Forest Service has never issued an official statement on Bigfoot. Oregon's Department of Fish and Wildlife has never opened a formal investigation despite 1,500 documented reports. And the timber industry, worth over $4 billion annually in Oregon, has never once been asked to comment on what Endangered Species Act protections might mean if a new primate were classified. Someone knows what lives in those trees. And until the public demands answers, the forests of Oregon will keep their darkest secret. The question is, for how much longer? The forests of Oregon are hiding something, and the people in power know exactly what it is. If this investigation opened your eyes to the truth lurking in America's wilderness, hit that like button right now. It helps more people find what's being buried. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an investigation, because what's out there in those trees might be closer than you think.